Hello and welcome to the second of the Unit 5 revision videos. Today we're going to be thinking about Unit 5.2, 5.3 and 5.4. These units are all about the policies towards the Jews and how they developed between 1933 and 1941. To begin with, it would be a good idea to write down what you can remember about Nazi policies towards the Jews between 1933 and 1941. Try and include things like what the Nazi aims were towards the Jews, what happened in the different years, what the different policies were, and also thinking about how events like World War II impacted on their policies. So pause the video here and try and write down what you can remember, because it will show you what you need to focus on in this video. You won't need to make any notes on this, but I do want to talk to you about the background of Nazi views on Jews and kind of where the origins of that were. Now, anti-Semitism, sadly, is not exclusive to Nazi Germany. It's not even exclusive to Germany as a country. And obviously, lots of Jewish people have experienced discrimination and prejudice across time, in lots of different countries and in lots of European countries as well. So anti-Semitism was not exclusive to Germany or new under the Nazis. Anti-Semitism was actually propagated through the New Testament, where Jews were shown as responsible for conspiring with the Romans to achieve the death of Jesus. The story of Judas as well is seen as the origin of this stereotypical association of Jews with greed and material gain. And because Christianity was one of the foundations of European culture, a negative depiction of the Jews was built into that culture and survived even when religious belief began to decline. For centuries, the Jews survived in Europe as a persecuted and despised minority. However, things got much worse when there was an economic depression in the 1870s. The Jews were seen as being responsible for this. And by the 1880s, there were numerous anti-Jewish movements in lots of European countries. And these movements drew on the old established expressions of hatred that were often rooted in Christianity. But now they were also utilising even more dangerous ideas and saying they didn't just dislike them based on religion, but actually there began to be these ideas of them being inferior based on race. The key here is that Jewish people couldn't change. If it was based on their religion, they could assimilate by changing their religion. But now there's this idea of them being a separate ethnic group and having some kind of alien blood. So remember that Hitler had disliked the Jews for a long time for his own twisted reasons. We can see here an extract from his book Mein Kampf, which was obviously published in 1924 whilst he was in prison for the Munich Putsch. Nazis generally used Jews as scapegoats in their propaganda, portraying them as responsible for all economic and political problems. However, it's worth bearing in mind that even though they blamed them for all these different problems, we don't necessarily know what their aim was from the beginning. It's clear that they wanted a Judenfrei society or a Jew-free society. But actually, to what extent they had planned to end up with the deaths of 6 million European Jews is highly debated. And if you see the last slide on this PowerPoint and on this video, it will talk to you about the historiography. We're about to start looking at what the Nazis did in different year groups and how they treated the Jews. Now, it's important to bear in mind that this very much was a gradualist policy. The early moves against the Jews gave no suggestion to the end result. We can see the progress here when we're looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, but obviously Jewish communities at this time had no idea that things were going to get worse. So first of all, stage one began with attacks on citizenship and discriminating against the Jews. And this really happened between 1933 to 1937. Even though they were constantly being attacked in their citizenship later on, this early period is very much about discrimination and kind of segregating and separating Jewish people from the rest of the community. The idea is that they want to push them out of normal life, out of normal jobs, and make other German citizens see them as being somehow different. We can see that with things like the Nuremberg laws, where they are forbidding marriages between Jews and non-Jews. By 1938, Nazis have really consolidated their position. They have now been in power for 5 years. They have solved lots of the economic problems, and they are feeling more confident, and therefore they are pursuing more radical policies. Moderate forces within the Nazi German state, for instance, within the economy, people like Schacht, have been pushed out. Hitler has greater control, for instance, over groups like the army, and he's pursuing a more aggressive foreign policy as well. So it's not just in policies towards the Jews that they become more extreme and radical from 1938 onwards, although we can see that they are much more radical with this period of violence towards the Jews too. Now, really, we see this period of mass violence beginning with the Night of Broken Glass, which happens in November 1938. After that, the gloves are off, as Goering said, and that meant that the Jews experienced mass violence with lots of people being sent to concentration camps. For instance, 30,000 were sent after the Night of Broken Glass. But we also get the start, after the outbreak of the Second World War, of Jews being removed to ghettos, and then we also get the mass murders, particularly once the Soviet Union has been invaded in June 1941. We get the start of the Eisengruppen murdering many innocent people. Stage 3 is seen as the final solution. This is the idea of the Nazis trying to come up with a final solution to the Jewish problem. And they meet formally in January 1942 at Wannsee, just outside of Berlin, to discuss their final solution. And here they come up with the administration and the kind of bureaucratic measures to try and exterminate all the Jews of Europe. The idea is that they will try and murder 60,000 Jewish people a day. Now, a lot of people argue actually the final solution had begun earlier than that, and it's certainly true that the decision must have been made before that date. But we see January 1942 as the start of this, because this is where they kind of came up with the paperwork and confirmed their plans. So as you can see, things got worse over time for the Jewish community. The Nazis' first official action began on the 1st of April 1933 with the boycotts of Jewish shops. Now, this was in response to the pressure that was growing for official anti-Semitic legislation, which was coming from both above, with people like Hitler and those that were in the top levels of Nazi leadership, but also from people below. So there was certainly an element of radical anti-Semites within the SA in particular that were trying to push the Nazis into making sure that they carried out some kind of official anti-Semitic legislation. Now, the Nazis were a little bit worried about this. The top levels, people like Hitler, were worried because they'd only just come to power in 1933 in January, and they had to try and make sure that they came up with a balance between creating internal stability, especially, as the Great Depression was still affecting many people. They had to try and think about economic progress and about the impact of this, and also international opinion. Nevertheless, they still started the boycotts on the 1st of April 1933, and this was originally supposed to go on for an indefinite amount of time. However, obviously the Nazis only made it for one day in the end. So Hitler allowed this to go ahead as a limited and grudging concession to his radical activists, those people within the SA that were growing quite frustrated at the lack of anti-Semitic legislation by this point. So this was something that was really pushed for by the SA, and the boycott itself was then carried out by those gangs of brown-shirted SA who stood outside the places of businesses, like we can see here, and targeting Jewish shops and trying to intimidate customers into not going into those shops. It wasn't just shops that were targeted on this day, they also targeted Jewish professionals, such as doctors and lawyers. For instance, court proceedings involved Jewish lawyers and judges were disrupted in Berlin and elsewhere. It was very much a coordinated attack. Sometimes as well, Jewish lawyers were attacked in the street and had their legal robes stripped off them. Jewish doctors, school teachers and university lecturers were also subjected to similar rough treatment by the SA. In terms of the impact, it's a really crucial event because it marked the beginning of a downward spiral for the Jews. The importance of this boycott was that it triggered a more radical response from the state. It wasn't just the boycotts in April 1933. They also published laws like the law for the reconstruction of a professional civil service, where they were sacking Jews from lots of high-powered and important jobs. So there were future laws that were passed as a result of the supposed success of this boycott. It was also a really important event because it made a big impact on Germany and kind of signified the start of Nazi anti-Semitic policy. It was featured in news coverage in both Germany and abroad, and that's one of the reasons why it didn't go on for longer than a day. Hitler was very worried that this might trigger a response, for instance, from a country like America, who might not be very happy about the way that they're discriminating against one group. So Nazis wanted to try and make this last indefinitely, but in the end, they had to abandon it after one day, and therefore we talk about this being a limited success. They didn't achieve exactly what they wanted with it, and actually a lot of Germans kind of defiantly used the shops anyway to show disapproval of Nazi policies. So it certainly wasn't an unqualified success, and there were some problems with it. But crucially, remember, this is the kind of start of a Nazi coordinated anti-Semitic policy. As well as thinking about the Jewish boycotts, you also need to know about other anti-Semitic legislation that was passed in 1933. And this begins with the Law for the Restoration of Professional Civil Service that was passed on the 7th of April 1933, very soon after the boycott. This required Jews to be dismissed from the civil service because the Nazis saw that as a key job being involved in government administration. However, it wasn't as straightforward as they hoped. We've already seen that the boycotts weren't the unqualified success they were hoping, that they were ended after a day, that actually some people defiantly carried on using Jewish shops even though the SA were trying to intimidate them. And they encounter problems as well when they try and pass a civil service law. First of all, it's very difficult for them to actually define exactly what they mean by somebody that's Jewish. For instance, do you only count people that practice the Jewish religion? Or actually, would you count people that have been assimilated into German society? So they found it very difficult to actually term who was Jewish, and in the end, they went down the definition of anybody with a Jewish parent or grandparent. They found further problems later on as well, because President Hindenburg, who remember could remove Hitler at any point at this time, he's still around until August 1934, he insisted on exemptions for German Jews that fought in World War One. Because of his role in the military, he felt very loyal to the ex-soldiers. And that meant that 12,000 Jews were excluded from this banning in the civil service. So it meant the impact of the law was lessened as it applied to up to 2/3 of the Jews in the civil service. So essentially, only 1/3 of the Jews lost their jobs as a result of this policy. Even though we're saying it didn't affect all Jews, obviously it still had a devastating economic and psychological impact on the middle class Jews of Germany and contributed to increasing levels of Jewish emigration. A really key statistic to bear in mind is in 1933, 37,000 Jews left Germany out of the 500,000 that there were. Most stayed behind though because they either had no idea how bad things would get or they couldn't actually organise being able to leave Germany. They couldn't find another country to accept them or they weren't in the financial position to do so. The civil service laws were the start of this series of decrees that banned Jews from many different jobs, and the civil service is the one that they began. So in the end, over the 12 years of Nazi rule, there were some 400 laws and decrees that targeted Jews, and obviously this is one of the original ones, it's one of the first ones that they put in place. It wasn't just the civil service that they were removed from. You can see lots of different jobs here and how they were pushed out of different professions throughout 1933 to varying degrees of success. So first of all, let's think about the legal profession. Now, actually, there were a lot of Jewish lawyers and 16% of Germany's legal profession were actually Jewish. This is because there were lots of family firms that were run by Jewish families. So we already know that during the Jewish boycotts, lots of Jewish lawyers and judges were targeted. For instance, they had their robes stripped off them in public and things like that. They also passed law the same day as civil service law to try and stop lawyers practicing. However, By the end of 1933, 60% of Jewish lawyers were able to continue working in spite of the new regulations. It wasn't an unqualified success. This is because they found many loopholes in the Nazi laws. It was a process that took several years to try and make the regulations much stricter. In terms of doctors as well, Jewish doctors made up a high proportion of Germany's total doctors, 11%. Again, they were attacked by propaganda as a danger to society. There was a particular propaganda campaign against Jewish doctors, for instance, suggesting that they were harming the health of Aryan patients deliberately, and all these kind of ridiculous stories that were published in newspapers. By April 1933, they had banned Jewish doctors from treating Aryan patients. They were allowed to continue practicing, but only to treat Jewish patients now. Nazi officials at local government level started trying to remove Jewish doctors from their post, and they used propaganda to try and turn the local community against them. However, at this point, most people were quite loyal to their family doctor. They often saw the same one, and therefore many Jewish doctors were actually able to carry on their normal practice for several years after 1933. In terms of education, in that same crucial month of April 1933, Nazis passed the law against the overcrowding of German schools and universities. This restricted the numbers of children who could attend state education. The idea was that they wanted to give Aryan children more resources and attention instead of the people who they believed would become the future enemies of the nation. In terms of things like universities, the amount of places that they could have were restricted to 1.5% to reflect the total number of Jews in the country. The process of getting Jewish children out of education was not properly completed until 1938. Many Jewish children still attended private schools and Jewish schools. They did struggle with funding and academic standards. So the Nazis, even though they couldn't necessarily stop Jews getting any kind of education as quickly as they wanted, we could still say that they were successful in the aim of segregating German society, of making German children grow up to believe that Jewish children were somehow different. The final area that I want you to know about is the press and how they tried to remove Jews from this area too. Now, this was passed in October 1933, the Reich Press Law, which was aimed at trying to remove their influence from the media. There was a lot of ideas about Jewish conspiracies where they controlled the media worldwide, and they were upset about the fact that 5% of Germany's newspaper editors were Jewish. So the Reich Press Law enabled the regime to apply strict censorship to close down publications they disliked. Jews had often had a prominent role in journalism, and so this law effectively silenced large numbers of them, forced them out of their jobs, and many were then forced to leave the country. And remember, by the end of 1933, 37,000 Jews had left the country. We've just thought about what the Nazis were doing throughout 1933. It's worth pausing here for a second and thinking about to what extent have the Nazis been successful with their anti-Semitic policy in 1933? What were the main successes? What were the main failures? You might want to just pause and make some notes on that before you then move on to thinking about the Nuremberg laws. So, the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935, and they were introduced because of pressure, often from below. So just like the boycotts were the result of the brown shirts in particular kind of pushing forward this anti-Semitic agenda, again with the Nuremberg laws, it's the fanatical anti-Semites in the Nazi movement that are the driving force behind it. Attacks against Jews and their businesses had increased throughout the summer of 1935 as they grew quite restless. And there had been also some anti-Jewish riots that had taken place in May and June 1935, where Jews had been attacked on the streets of Berlin. Now, this isn't very good for Hitler. He's trying to kind of push this image of the Nazi state, being very much one that is controlled and about them, being legal and emphasizing the kind of legality. And therefore, he doesn't like the fact that the brown shirts are becoming restless and decides to do something that is going to appease them and calm them down again. So at the Nuremberg rally in 1935 in September, Hitler had announced these kind of radical new laws that they hadn't actually drafted the legislation for yet. And after the Nuremberg rally, they then drafted the legislation and then put it into place. And this really does show us the kind of ad hoc nature of decisions and the kind of chaotic state of the Nazis. The fact that they are sometimes announcing policies before they've even thought them through. So there are two aspects of the Nuremberg laws that you need to know about. There are only two official Nuremberg-style laws: the Reich Citizenship Law and also the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honour. So the Reich Citizenship Law said that somebody could only be a German citizen if they had purely German blood. So Jews and other non-Aryans were now classified as subjects and they had fewer rights than citizens. This meant that they could legally discriminate against them and treat them differently. Linked to it is this idea of the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honour, and this outlawed marriage between Aryans and non-Aryans. It made it illegal for German citizens to marry or have sexual relations with Jews, and later it was extended to cover any physical contact. So these two laws make up the Nuremberg laws that are now aimed to try and socially isolate Jewish people from the rest of the communities. They'd already begun that process in 1933 with the boycott and then removing them from different professions. Nuremberg laws is a real example here of them trying to completely segregate Jews from the rest of society, about making them seem different and about emphasising these differences to the German public as well. People that were already married were now forced to separate or risk being put in a concentration camp. Pause the video here if you need to make any notes about what the Nuremberg laws actually were, but we'll talk about the impact on the next slide. Nuremberg laws had a horrendous impact on Jewish citizens. They made them feel as if they had no more legal rights and that they were second-class citizens. And obviously, it was aimed at destroying relationships, and the Nazis had some success with achieving that. They managed now to isolate Jews socially because they weren't allowed into certain places. There wasn't official laws that said that they couldn't go there, but the idea was that they were now legally classed as different citizens, and therefore lots of local businesses were able to discriminate against them openly. They were encouraged to do so because the Nazis had passed these Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws are absolutely crucial because they represent a turning point in the radicalisation of the state. It made discrimination completely legal and acceptable now. And now, people like the Gestapo, the judges and courts can now more strictly enforce anti-Semitism because they're now legally able to, now that Jews are not citizens with the full rights of a German citizen. And these laws served their purpose. Nazis had wanted to try and contain the more radical anti-Semites, and actually these laws had ended localised attacks on Jews. Before there had been a surge of anti-Semitism, now the Nazis had managed to control it. And it also allowed for a few years the Jewish question to be placed on the back burner. Nazis had other priorities at this point. For instance, in 1936, they're focusing on the Olympics and thinking about the propaganda value internationally for them with the Olympics. And they're also thinking about things like the 4-year economic plan. We've already mentioned that some local people decided to extend the Nuremberg laws and create their own Nuremberg-style laws. For instance, in the southern city or southern area of Bavaria, many Jews there were banned from using swimming pools because of the mayor and what he had decided. This happened in lots of different places where Jews ended up being banned from restaurants, from even things like park benches, even things like walking on the sidewalk, because people had been encouraged by these official Nuremberg laws and decided to make their own. So for many Jews, they found signs saying Jews not welcome that were displayed everywhere. However, it is worth thinking about to what extent was this passed because the people of Germany really supported these laws. There is some evidence from Gestapo reports and the Sappada reports from the SPD in exile that German public opinion didn't fully support the Nuremberg laws. Now, there was no public outcry, there was no public protest against this, but still that maybe shows that there had been some private grumbling about this. Historians have thought about why didn't they protest against this, and why did loads of businesses put Jews not welcome signs up? Was it because they were really anti-Semitic as much as the Nazis, or was it just about keeping the Nazis happy? So eventually, we've got to think about this in terms of to what extent anti-Semitism had penetrated German thought and consciousness. To what extent were they actually supportive of the Nuremberg laws? Or to what extent had the people just retreated into internal exile because they were too scared of the Nazis and didn't think it was worth protesting against these policies towards the Jews? So it's definitely worth thinking about your own ideas here. To what extent do you think the German people actually were deeply anti-Semitic? To what extent do they support this? To what extent do they dislike the Nuremberg laws? And if they did dislike the Nuremberg laws, why didn't they do anything about it? The only other thing to bear in mind in this section on discrimination after the Nuremberg laws is that, as we mentioned before, the Olympics led to a temporary slackening of anti-Semitic measures because the international stage, well, with the focus of the international stage here, people were looking at them, and therefore they hadn't want to risk upsetting other nations by being so outwardly anti-Semitic when that might trigger, for instance, some economic measures against them. So at the time, they decided to kind of basically ease off in terms of their anti-Semitic measures for a while. However, pressure then builds again after the Olympics from 1937, where there was increasing pressure from, again, those fanatical anti-Semites for more radical action. We already know from the 5.1 video that the Nazis became more radical over time, and we're now going to be moving on to thinking about this phase 3 of Nazi Germany, where we get the radicalisation of the state from 1938 to 1939. And remember that 1938 is seen as the turning point in anti-Semitic policy as well, because it's the year where we first get this mass violence against the Jews. So to begin with, just thinking again about this radicalisation that you can see highlighted here, remember that this is generally because the Nazis have got rid of lots of the cautious people, for instance, the economics minister Schacht, people like Beck in terms of the army, and essentially they're replacing them with real extremists, people like Goering, and the Nazis over time have also become less worried about foreign investors, and they just want Jews gone from businesses by this point. We've seen that these kind of fanatical anti-Semites are building from 1937, and we can see the impact of this on their policy from 1938 onwards. Now, this period of time is also absolutely crucial when it comes to Hitler's foreign policy. Remember from GCSE that Hitler had aimed to destroy the Treaty of Versailles, to gain Lebensraum and unite German speakers, and he wanted to destroy communism. Before 1938, what he was doing was generally inside Germany, with things like remilitarising the Rhineland in 1936. But by 1938, Nazis were becoming increasingly radicalised in terms of their foreign policy and their racial policy. Hopefully you can remember from GCSE, in March 1938, Nazis took over Austria when they carried out the Anschluss, and that brought another 180,000 Jews into the German Reich. So it therefore expanded the so-called Jewish problem. Nazis then pursued more relentless anti-Semitic policies in Austria, and lots of people that were there at the time talked about how in Austria they caught up with 5 years of anti-Semitic legislation in about 5 days. The Nazis were able to act without restraint in Austria because it wasn't part of Germany itself, and therefore they weren't as worried about the reaction of the people. It then also led to them carrying out more radical policies within Germany itself, because they'd seen that actually there wasn't very much opposition in Austria. It was basically their kind of test subject, and then they brought back some more harsh policies in Germany itself. So the Nazi regime has become more radicalised over time in terms of foreign policy and anti-Semitism, and 1938 is this kind of turning point where we start to get more violence because they're now expanding and the Jewish problem has expanded too. Let's think more specifically now about the Anschluss itself and what was going on for Austrian Jews. As we've mentioned, the Nazis invaded Austria in in March 1938. And in terms of the Austrian Jewish population, there's about 183,000 Jews living in Austria. The large majority of them actually lived in Vienna. Now, the Austrian anti-Semites, in lots of ways, were actually more fanatical than the Germans. We can see that when we look at images like this, where we have got some Austrian anti-Semites that are forcing Jews to clean the streets with toothbrushes and things like that in front of jeering crowds. You know, scenes like that hadn't been seen in Germany. And so we can see that actually the Austrians were kind of pursuing and trying to get this more aggressive anti-Semitic policy than even what was going on in Germany at that point. For Austrian Jews, there was a real shock with Nazi policies. Obviously, the policies had been shocking enough to German Jews, but they'd had small ones brought in over time. For Austrian Jews, overnight, they lost their rights to property and employment and were now subjected to physical assaults. The reason why it is so bad for Jews in Austria is because the Nazis there were allowed to act against the Jews without constraint. Hitler wasn't worried about consolidating his position in Austria first, the way that he had been in Germany, and that explains why anti-Semitic measures were brought in so much quicker in Austria itself. As a result of these terrible policies, within a month, 500 Austrian Jews had committed suicide. And by the end of 1938, bear in mind that they'd only invaded in March, the homes of 40,000 Jews had been stolen, and more than 1,500 Austrian Jews had been sent to concentration camps. Now, this kind of thing hadn't really been going on in Germany. The first time German Jews were actually sent to concentration camps was after the Night of Broken Glass. So we can see that these policies are taken action and taken place in Austria really quickly, and the Austrian Jews are subjected to terrible treatment. One reason why people say that they were treated so badly is because in lots of ways Austria was used as a lab to kind of develop the SS policy. For instance, you might remember a man called Eichmann, who was now overseeing a new organisation called the New Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which was created in Vienna. Here they were trying to test out forced emigration, and he actually forced 45,000 Austrian Jews to emigrate. When they saw that as a success, they then extended this Central Office for Jewish Emigration into Germany too. Then eventually they're going to force German Jews to also emigrate without a choice. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes about the Anschluss with Austria. We've already mentioned that the events in Austria lead to further discrimination in Germany, and that's a really key point. We know that the Nazi regime has become more radicalised and they feel that they're able to get away with more aggressive anti-Semitic policies. Furthermore, the invasion of Austria also increased the pressure on the Jewish question, and therefore it allowed Goering to take more radical economic action against the Jews in Germany itself. Remember, at this point, they are very much about trying to encourage people to emigrate. They've also been trying to socially isolate Jewish people and harm them economically, which is also going to benefit the Nazi state, as they're going to steal, the Jewish belongings and things like that. So what kind of things were now going on in Germany after the Anschluss with Austria? Well, they were now accelerating their economic persecution. For instance, in April 1938, a month after the Anschluss, the decree for the registration of Jewish property allowed confiscation of property that was worth over 5,000 marks. That's basically all property in Germany at this point. And by the end of 1939, there were only 8,000 Jewish businesses left out of an original 40,000. So 32,000 of them had been closed down. Jews were now also losing their entitlement to public welfare and had to rely on Jewish charities. But obviously those Jewish charities were now under even more strain because they've got to look after more people with less donations. And then the Nazis then started trying to strip them of their individuality. For instance, the fact that they now stamp their passports with a large J to show that they're only defined by being Jewish. And eventually from 1939, they made Jews take a different first name. For instance, all Jewish women were now named Sarah. a second, we're going to be moving on to thinking about the Night of Broken Glass, Right Kristallnacht. But before we do, I just want to do a quick summary of what the Nazis have been intending to do so far and what their policy has been until now. We know that they have put in place lots of different anti-Semitic legislation over the years, started with things like the boycotts and the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, went to things like the Nuremberg laws in 1935, and then we've thought about how they became more radicalised with the Anschluss in March 1938. By November of 1938, a total of 150,000 Jews had chosen to leave Germany. It wasn't all of them, obviously, it was the ones that actually could leave because they had the influence and wealth to be able to do so. The fact that so many Jews had left had actually suited the Nazis, as many historians argue that originally emigration was seen as a solution to the Jewish problem by the Nazi leadership. It also helped them out, as well as by removing Jews from the community where they wanted to create this Aryan race. It also helped them as well because it allowed for massive economic exploitation. However, remember that not all the Jews that wanted to leave could. Some were determined to stay because they felt that it was unfair to be pushed out of their own country. But also remember that some Jews couldn't leave Germany, even though they knew things were escalating, because they couldn't get into other nations. They weren't allowed to emigrate. There wasn't anywhere to go. And this is really epitomised by the fact that there was a conference in July 1938 where 32 nations attended the Evian conference, yet they didn't actually agree how they were going to help Jewish refugees. They just discussed how bad it was that so many were struggling in countries like Germany. But again, countries wouldn't actually allow anybody in. So that's what we need to know so far about anti-Semitic decrees and thinking about that period of discrimination against Jewish people. We're now going to move on to thinking about the start of mass violence that really begins with the turning point of the Night of Broken Glass. So you need to know about the events of Kristallnacht that happened in November 1938. But remember, in an exam, we don't want to be too descriptive. We want to be able to think about the impact and what this demonstrates about Nazi policy. But in order to understand the impact, it's worth us just going over these details so you remember the key facts. So first of all, remember that this began when the Germans were incredibly angry after a German diplomat, a man called von Rath, had been assassinated by a Jewish teenager in Paris. Nazis had been waiting for some kind of event to allow them to justify their anti-Semitic actions. And this gave a great opportunity for Goebbels to try and organise a pogrom. Remember that this kind of tension and these fanatical anti-Semites had wanted more aggressive policy since 1937, and they get it in November 1938 with Kristallnacht. This was a terrible event where over the course of 2 days, over 250 synagogues were burnt, over 7,000 Jewish businesses were trashed and looted, 91 Jewish people were killed, and 30,000 German Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Remember that camps had existed since 1933, but this is the first time en masse that people are put in them for just being Jewish. After this as well, life became even more difficult for German and Austrian Jewish children, teenagers and adults. People were now not allowed to go into lots more public places, and lots of people were now even more segregated than they had been before. There was an increasing rate of suicides as a result, and lots of families tried desperately to leave. But remember, we've just discussed before, actually you had to have the influence and wealth to be able to do so. Nevertheless, by November 1938, a total of 150,000 Jews out of the 500,000 had chosen to leave Germany. So that's what you need to know about the events. Don't try and remember all the statistics. You might choose, for instance, to remember about the 91 that were killed and the 30,000 men that were arrested, and then you don't have to remember all the others. So pick the ones that you would want to be able to use in an exam answer. And remember, most crucially, that Kristallnacht is important because it marks the turning point and signals the start of a more violent persecution of the Jews. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes on this. As we've already mentioned, Kristallnacht was a turning point, and we have to think about who's responsible for this massive shift in Nazi policy from being one of discrimination to moving now to this kind of mass coordinated violence, which we know only gets worse over time because it leads to things like the ghettos, it leads to things like the Eisengruppen shooting squads. So this is a really crucial event. Let's think about who's responsible. Now, in your exercise books, you should have a sheet that looks like this, or even the notes from these different groups about how different groups were responsible. Now, obviously, Goebbels was incredibly key here because he was the chief instigator of this event. He also had been planning something and waiting for a moment to organise a pogrom, and he was the one that sent the order. The SA and the SS were the people that actually carried out this event. They were the ones that carried out those lootings of those 7,000 Jewish businesses. They're the ones that are burning down the synagogues, and they're the ones that are arresting those 30,000 Jewish men. If we think about the ordinary Germans, they still had a role with the fact that they stood back. Now, even though not all people were supportive of this, and actually there was quite a lot of public criticism and people that didn't like the fact that it had caused such chaos and disorganisation. You know, they didn't like the fact that the shops had all this glass all over the floor. Generally, they didn't do anything to actually stand up against this policy. They didn't signal that this wasn't okay, and therefore it allowed the Nazis to build on this policy as they believed that generally the German people had accepted it. But really crucially, when we're thinking about the horror of Kristallnacht, we need to think about what it allowed Goering to do afterwards, about how it changed the policies towards the Jews. And in terms of Goering, he said himself after this event, now the gloves are off. He now felt that he was much freer than before as a result of this horror of Kristallnacht and as a result of the Anschluss, both of them taking place in 1938. He felt that he was able to now push forward with discrimination and coordinate the next stage of it. He economically badly harmed the Jews by doing things like preventing insurance companies from paying out compensation because he said that the Jews were at fault. He also made the Jews pay 1 billion Reichsmarks in repairs and for the disruption to the economy. And then, as we've already mentioned in a previous slide, on the 12th of November, he passed a decree for the exclusion of Jews from economic life. And that said that all remaining Jewish businesses had to be shut down and Jews were forbidden to seek work from a non-Jew. So Kristallnacht is important in itself for the event, but it's also very important because it represents a shift in policy towards violence, and it feels like the Nazis can get away with more now as the German public has broadly accepted everything that's gone on so far, including the mass violence and chaos of Kristallnacht. Pause the video here if you want to make some notes about who was responsible and what happened afterwards. The next area that we need to know about is the impact of World War II on anti-Semitic policy. Now, before we think about the impact, it's important for us to just think about some summary points about their policies before the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939. Now, before World War II, Nazi anti-Semitic policy had aimed to try and encourage Jews to emigrate and to try and isolate them socially from the rest of the German people or the German Volk. There had been some violence, for instance, with events like Kristallnacht in November 1938, when 91 Jewish people had been killed. But most of the measures that were actually passed were aimed at discriminating against them and hurting them economically, financially, and allowing the Nazis to benefit from this anti-Semitic legislation. Even before the war, though, we know that the Nazi state had become more radical from 1938. There was a real shift with some of the more moderate elements pushed out, people like Schacht, and now the Nazis were listening more to extremists like Himmler and Goering, all these crucial people that wanted to push anti-Semitic policy further forward. We can see that they were much more radical from 1938. Even if we just think about their foreign policy, they certainly became much more aggressive after 1938. Before 1938, everything they'd really been doing, like rearming, remilitarising the Rhineland, most of that had been going on in Germany itself. Now, in 1938, they're doing things like invading Austria, and later on that year, remember, they try and take over the Sudetenland. So they're much more aggressive in terms of their foreign policy, and they're much more aggressive in terms of their anti-Semitic policy as well. So we're going to look at the impact, for instance, of the Anschluss. Obviously, we've already seen that meant that the anti-Semitic policy became even worse in Germany as well. So we've seen about how they've become more radicalised. Let's now think about the impact of World War II itself. Now, the first thing to be aware of is that war has an enormous impact on anti-Semitic policy because it alters the Jewish problem, as the Nazis called it. Before, they've had relatively small numbers of Jews. They've had about 500,000 in Germany and about 180,000 in Austria. But now that they're expanding into the east and countries like Poland, they've now got new Jewish people who are enlarging their so-called Jewish problem. For instance, we think about Poland as a country. There were 3.1 million Jews living in Poland, and the Nazis believed that that caused them strategic problems. They also particularly disliked the Jews in the East because they tended to be more orthodox and less assimilated, and therefore they were more obviously seen as subhuman according to the Nazis. So World War II impacts their policies because there's an emphasis on moving away from this kind of voluntary immigration they had before. Now moving to things like forced emigrations, and then they go to things like deportations and then resettling Jews into places like the ghettos. Try to use an area of Poland called the General Government Area that we'll talk more about on future slides. And just here, it just talks to you about some reasons why does war impact their policy, and it's got a list of reasons there about why this allows them to become more extreme. But the key thing is that you understand that World War II did lead to them becoming more radical in their policies towards the Jews. Pause here if you want to make any notes. Nazis had done a deal with the Soviet Union to take Poland and split it between them in August 1939 in something called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now, they had taken an area in the west, the Soviets had taken an area in the east, and the area left between them was called the General Government. This included lots of places that are going to become future ghettos. Now, even though it wasn't technically German of the German Reich, the Germans still controlled this area, and it was run by a governor called Hans Frank. Now, Hitler wanted to use this area as a dumping ground for the Jews. He wanted to separate them from the rest of the population and decided this was the best place to do this. In September 1939, the same month as they invaded Poland, Hitler informed a man called Rosenberg, who was his minister for the Eastern Occupied Territories, that all Jews, including those within the Reich, were to be moved to this general government area. He says that they need to be put somewhere in here, and he talks about different rivers, the River Vistula and the River Bug, and he talks about them going somewhere in between those two lines that I've just drawn on the map there. So at the moment, we can see if Hitler's talking about dumping them into this area of the general government, we can talk about how we are seeing a territorial solution to the so-called Jewish problem at this point. Some historians talk about this being an interim measure before they come up with a final solution. You need to think about your own argument. Would you suggest this is what the Nazis saw as the end goal of their Jewish policy, or would you suggest it's an interim measure? So in this area that's green on the map, the general government, they established the first reservation. It's sometimes talked about as a ghetto, but actually most of the time we talk about it as a reservation because it wasn't yet sealed like the later ghettos were. So the very first movement of people into another area happens in September 1939. And it's not just Jews from Poland that end up there. Jews from Poland, Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, all of them are sent there. So in November 1939 to February 1940, you can see here that 550,000 Jews were actually deported to this area. Now, this sheer number of people being put into a relatively small area in a very quick space of time led to Hans Frank, the governor of this general government area, saying that the area couldn't hold any more Jews. This then led to the Madagascar Plan solution that the Nazis came up with. So the Madagascar Plan was something that the Nazis considered to try and be a solution to the so-called Jewish problem between the late summer and early autumn of 1940. At the IHSA, SS experts like Eichmann had been working on schemes for mass emigration of Jews. Remember that they'd been discussing this and thinking about it, particularly since they had invaded Austria in March 1938. And you might remember what Eichmann had done there in Austria. They also thought about trying to move Jews in the past to places like Palestine. However, that hadn't worked out because it was a relatively small territory and it was under British rule, and therefore, obviously, it was impossible to send them there when the British hadn't yet been defeated. The fact that the Nazis were able to defeat France made them have the idea of moving the Jews to Madagascar. They thought it was a good place to send them because it was far away, it offered more space, and there was no serious political problems to get around. And they planned to send 4 million Jews to Madagascar, which was a former French colony. The idea was that they were going to send farmers and construction workers at first to try and get the island ready for the mass influx of Jews. They intended that these conditions would be terrible. They wanted people to die. And the idea of it was this long-term elimination of the Jews by the so-called natural wastage. At this point, they hadn't considered things like the gassings that they later would decide on in the end of 1941, and obviously what they would then build in 1942 at places like Auschwitz. So this was an earlier plan for them to try and deal with the so-called Jewish problem. However, this particular plan was very short-lived. By October 1940, Hitler was already planning to try and invade the Soviet Union, thinking that he was going to defeat Britain relatively soon. The Madagascar Plan was then shelved in favour of sending Jews to Siberia after they had completed the conquest in the USSR. Now, the Madagascar Plan itself is highly debated by historians about what it really means. They all agree what happened and the fact that the Nazis considered this as a location to send the Jews. But actually, what it reveals is the thing that's debated. Some people say it proves the decision to exterminate all Jews was not made or not inevitable. The fact that they're shifting between these policies of ghettos, the Madagascar Plan, some people suggest that they hadn't yet decided to murder all Jewish people. However, other historians say this actually shows their long-term goal of sending Jews to die was fixed, even if the exact location was not. A great historian to remember what they say about this is a man called Kershaw, who suggested that at this point the solution to the Jewish problem had become synonymous with genocide. The Madagascar Plan shows the fact that the Nazis were kind of adapting their plans, but whether or not it shows they intended to kill all Jews is something you need to consider. Pause here if you'd like to make some notes on the Madagascar Plan. In the same year that the Nazis were considering sending Jews to Madagascar, they were also opening a lot of ghettos throughout their occupied territories. For instance, they had established the Lodz ghetto in February 1940. Now, we've already mentioned the fact that they had been creating some so-called reservations since September 1939. But what made the ghettos different is the fact that these were closed off from the rest of the country. The idea was that these particular areas that housed Jews would be isolated. They wanted people cut off from civilization, their friends, their previous life, their livelihoods, and they intended the conditions to be horrendous. So there's some similarity here with what they were doing in places like Madagascar when they planned it, because they are intending people to die of these conditions. For instance, if we think about the Lodz ghetto as a case study, 21% of the Jews that lived there died as a result of the low rations and also the terrible conditions where people ended up being very susceptible to lots of different diseases. When they were in these ghettos as well, they were forced to do harsh and hard labour. So that's the Lodz ghetto, and you can see a picture there of some of the victims of the Holocaust walking towards the Lodz ghetto, where they were then sealed up and some spent the rest of their lives. We also want to think about ghettos generally, though, and not just thinking about this one case study and this one example. Now, what was really consistent in all the ghettos is that the Nazis restricted the amount of food, medical supplies, and other goods that were in these places. As we've already mentioned, there was deliberate overcrowding, and on average, 15 people shared an apartment. Few homes had running water, and often food and fuel were scarce. Diseases like typhus spread rapidly. Lots of people within the ghettos tried to make the best of the situation, and Jewish councils were established in every ghetto. They tried to keep up some level of normality. For instance, they provided illegal schools for children, they had things like printing presses, but obviously they were limited on how much they could do for the people that lived there. In total, 500,000 Jews died in the ghettos as a result of the terrible conditions. So out of those 6 million Jewish people that died in total in the Holocaust, 500,000 of them had died in the ghettos. In an exam, you might want to remember an example of the Lodz ghetto, or instead, if you prefer, you could try and remember something about the Warsaw Ghetto, which was the largest ghetto and was established in October 1940 and housed 400,000 Jews. Pause here if you want to make some notes on the ghettos themselves. We've already seen with the outbreak of war, actually the Nazis have become more extreme. For instance, we've seen that they first of all considered reservations in Poland, nearby where many of these original Jews had lived. However, they're then starting by the summer of 1940 to consider shipping Jews off to Madagascar, which is obviously very far away. We know that the Nazis get more extreme as well from June 1941, because this is when they launched Operation Barbarossa, or the invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, this war in the East was completely different to the one in the West. It was a war of racial annihilation. It was a crusade against people that they saw as inferior. It was fought with a savagery and ideological intensity that was completely different to the war that they waged against the Western Allies. The atmosphere of the war in the East was one that saw troops killing as part of their overall mission. We've just mentioned about the savagery of the war in the East, and this is really epitomised by the Eisengruppen, who were around from 1939, but particularly important in terms of what they were doing in the Holocaust from 1941. Now, when we're talking about the Eisengruppen, they are sometimes called the Special Forces, and they were 4 mobile units of men, about 3,000 people that came from branches within the SS and the SD and police personnel. And you can see some of them pictured here. Now, these groups operated throughout Nazi-controlled territory in the East from 1939. At first, they'd been doing things like securing government files, and in 1939 they had also murdered 7,000 Jews. However, they become even more extreme in terms of the amount of people they are murdering from 1941, after we get Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. This is because we get the start of this more aggressive racial war then, and the Eisengruppen became even more important at that point. These groups of men were responsible for killing thousands of Jews in a day, quite often, regardless of their age or sex, and they were typically doing this by shooting. However, eventually, by late summer 1941, had started to use gas vans because Himmler became worried about their psychological state. In terms of what they were doing and why this had such an impact on them, why Himmler was worried, is because they were carrying out this genocide of innocent people, murdering sometimes a few people at a time, to some operations that meant that they killed tens of thousands in a day or across a couple of days. One of the worst atrocities happens in the Ukraine in September 1941 at a location called Babi Yar, where 30,000 innocent men, women and children are killed in 2 days by just one of the battalions in the Eisengruppen. So these people were carrying out face-to-face murder were marching people to these sites, making them dig their own graves, and then executing them. It was very close work, and it was absolutely horrific, obviously, the policies themselves. And the Nazis, obviously, were not concerned with what they were doing to those people, but just concerned about the officers carrying this out. And that is why they then moved to gas vans. And that's why they then look at being able to kill more people in a more, it's horrible to say, but a more efficient manner. And that's why we get the start of the extermination camps like Auschwitz, particularly from the start of 1942. These 3,000 men involved in the Eisengruppen squads killed over 1 million people. So out of those 6 million people that died in the Holocaust, we've already mentioned 500,000 die in the ghettos. Another 1 million are killed in this way by the Eisengruppen. And obviously, some historians have debated to what extent we can see this as part of the final solution. Some people say that this was organised killings and it was deliberate killings of any men, women or children that were Jewish that they could find, and therefore it's part of the final solution. And other historians argue that this was a terrible policy, but it wasn't necessarily part of this final solution, because this is particularly being carried out against people in the East. This kind of atrocity is not happening really in locations in the West, for instance, in places like France. So for some historians, they say this is the start of the final solution, and for some, they say this is a final solution in the East, but we can't see this as a European-wide genocide. It's up to you to decide what you think. Would you argue the Eisengruppen are part of this final solution to this so-called Jewish problem, or would you say it's not quite at that level in this summer of 1941? Pause here if you want to make some notes on the Eisengruppen. Over the last few slides, we've thought about the impact of World War II on Nazi anti-Semitic policies. This has just got a quick recap that you're more than welcome to pause and then have a little look at. It doesn't have any more detail than what's on the previous slides. It's just a very quick summary. You could have just a quick read to remind yourself of the key points from those last few slides. You might even decide that you're going to make something similar to this yourself, and you're going to make some kind of timeline of the Holocaust and how things escalated over time. That would be a great revision activity. For those students looking to get an A or an A star, it's really important that you understand the historiography of this massive issue of Hitler's policies towards the Jews. So at the heart of this debate is the idea of, did Hitler intend to kill Jewish people right from the beginning? Did he always have that plan? Or was he more of an opportunist and just kind of went with what he was able to get away with at the time, and there wasn't necessarily this kind of overarching grand plan? So this is something that has really divided historians for a very long time, because it's not just about the Holocaust, it's also thinking about, you know, the way Nazi Germany was run and the leadership, and to what extent it was a strong dictatorship with certain aims that they had from the very beginning, or to what extent do they kind of just act on an ad hoc basis. So it is a massive historiographical issue. Now, historians are normally divided into different schools of thought. They wouldn't necessarily define themselves as belonging to one of these schools of thought, but this is how we kind of roughly divide them. So first of all, we have the intentionalist historians. These are people that suggest that Hitler had committed to the extermination of the Jews at an early stage in his political career. Disagree about exactly when that was, but they broadly share this principle that Hitler had always intended to end up with the Holocaust. They suggest that Hitler's commitment was then followed by a consistent gradualist policy, which led systematically from persecution to the gates of Auschwitz. So they're kind of arguing here that, the boycotts, the Nuremberg laws, the Night of Broken Glass, then going to ghettos, and then going to things like the final solution was part of this kind of master plan, maybe of testing the German people to see how they responded to different things, and that he felt that a gradual approach was best. So, for instance, one historian talks about, in the end, only the question of opportunity mattered. So remember, intentionist historians very much believe that Hitler had from the very beginning this aim and objective of trying to murder all of Europe's Jews. Now, on the other side, there is the idea of the structuralists or the functionalists. Sometimes named one of those, sometimes people talk about both. They are the same sort of thing. So here, these historians are actually arguing that Nazi policies were unsystematic. They emphasise the fact that the Nazi state was chaotic, it was disorganised, it was disorderly, and often people were just working towards the Führer and pursuing different policies according to what they thought would please Hitler at that moment. So they talk about him being an opportunist here. So there's certainly a bit of crossover here about the idea of opportunity, but remember the difference is that intentionalists are saying that the gates of Auschwitz, the final solution was always the goal, whereas structuralists and functionists are suggesting it might have ended up there because of opportunity, but it wasn't necessarily always the goal. There wasn't, as one historian talks about, it wasn't a grand design. It was actually more of a kind of twisted path about opportunity. So they talk about the fact that it was often a kind of piece of improvisation in an unexpected situation rather than being some sort of set plan that they had from the very beginning. For instance, some of those historians that are structuralists and functionalists talk about the fact that Hitler's policies had led to mass emigration. And by 1940, more than half of the Jews in Germany and lots of the Jews in Austria basically had been driven out. So therefore, we can't necessarily say he was set on this policy of European genocide, because that wouldn't help him, get towards that aim. It would make it more difficult for him to be able to reach those Jews if his aim ultimately was to get rid of all Jews and murder all Jews. So I suppose ultimately it kind of comes down to, what your view is on this. Do you think that he aimed to kill all Jews right from the beginning? Or do you feel like that wasn't necessarily the aim? Historians certainly agree that Hitler wanted to get rid of the Jews, but how he wanted to do that, how that would be achieved, is an issue of a massive historiographical debate. Some people kind of fall in the middle, and they are sometimes talked about being the moderate intentionalist historians who are saying, for instance, that Hitler was the driving force behind the Holocaust and is kind of ultimately the most responsible, but actually they kind of have this idea of, did he actually have a strategy from the outset? They kind of question it. They're kind of often in between those two different schools of thinking. So it's important that you think about your own ideas. And as I mentioned, if you want an A or an A star, you want to mention these kind of arguments. Have to call them the intentionalists and the structuralists in your answer, because you don't want to get bogged down into just repeating this kind of fact. But you certainly want to show these ideas in your answer and talk about the fact that this is a very hotly debated topic about whether it was this grand design, whether the final solution was planned from the beginning or not. You've now got to the end of this Unit 5 revision video. We've gone through all of the Nazi policies between 1933 and 1941. I gave you this timeline when we were studying the Holocaust. You might even want to look back at this now and colour code it or remind yourself of those key things. You could even make your own timeline as part of your revision activities if you wanted to. Well done for listening to this knowledge overview on policies towards the Jews. There's been lots to take in, and you might decide that you need to come back and listen to bits of this video again, or even the whole thing if you're still not feeling very confident and comfortable with the topic. It's also really important, as well as listening to things like this, that you do something with it. I've mentioned already about doing things like making a timeline. That would be a really good idea. You could also do something like making a Cornell grid. Remember, this is where you have the dates and a timeline on the left side of your page, then you have space for notes, and at the bottom you have a summary of some key points. That would be a really good activity to do because there's so much to know on policies towards the Jews. You could even now carry out your own red pen and black pen activity. You could compare it to what you did at the start of this video and see how much more do you actually know off by heart now. And again, those areas that you're a bit weaker on, you could go back and watch those bits of the video again if that helps. As always as well, I think it's a great idea to plan out an exam question. This is the best thing you can do because it helps you with the knowledge, it helps you consolidate it, but it also prepares you for exams really well because you're getting used to exactly how you plan an answer, you're getting used to thinking about your arguments and how you link paragraphs and all those key skills you need for exams. So we've got here an example of an essay question that you could have a go at. Hitler's policies towards both the Jews and other minority groups in the years 1933 to 1941 were consistent. If you don't want to have a go at this question, you could always go into your black folders and look at the list of questions, and you could pick one from the Unit 5 questions there. So make sure you're doing something with it. On the next slide, I'm just going to talk to you quickly about the short answer tests as well. So just to remind you that on Teams, there are short answer tests that can help you with your learning. I know some of you like to use short answer tests to just help you with those really quick facts and to help you with your memory and retrieval. Now, there are 3 different short answer tests on policies towards the Jews for Unit 5. There's a short answer test on 5.2 that you can see as a screenshot here. There's also a short answer test on 5.3, and again, there's a short answer test on 5.4. So you might decide that you want to make some flashcards of that so that you can try and remember the really key information. All of these short answer tests can be found on Teams in our short answer test folder. Well done for getting to the end of the video. Remember, make sure you're doing something with this information now. Make sure you're doing something to really help consolidate it and make sure that you're feeling really confident on this topic.